Hello everyone and welcome to lecture 52. So in our previous lecture, we had looked at the case of a price ceiling. Recall, a price ceiling is the maximum legal price at which trade takes place, and we said for a price ceiling to be effective, it always must be below the equilibrium price. If you impose a ceiling price which is above the equilibrium price, the buyers and sellers are going to essentially ignore that price ceiling. And then what we learnt was that when a price ceiling is imposed, there is a mismatch between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. The equilibrium gets distorted. Because the equilibrium gets distorted, what happens is that you need to impose some rule of allocating the QS units across the number of buyers. And the assumption that we imposed was that we want to allocate the units such that the available units are rationed or allotted in a way such that it gets into the hands of those buyers who value them the most. And we looked at this particular example to numerically find out what the consumer surplus and producer surplus were. And we learned that here there was a transfer from the producer to the consumer. In this particular example, the previous producer surplus or the surplus to the producer in the absence of any regulation was rupees 18. Post the ceiling price, the producer surplus was rupees 8. So essentially rupees 10 was the loss that the producer suffered. The gain to the consumer, of course, now this 10 was actually is what the producer has lost. Of this 10, 4 went to the consumer, because notice the consumer surplus increased from 36 to 40. So the producer lost 10, of which 4 went as a transfer to the consumer. So 6 was sort of unaccounted, right, or the reduction in surplus which nobody received, and that is this particular area. We said that the source of the deadweight loss are the units between 4 and 6 which are no longer allocated. Now, what we will do today is we will look at one other interesting regulation, which is a price floor. So, unlike a ceiling price, a price floor is a minimum legal price at which trade takes place. So, let us first put the definition. So, a price floor is the minimum legal price at which trade takes place. So, immediately you can identify that since it is the minimum legal price at which trade takes place, a valid price floor has to be necessarily greater than the equilibrium price, right. Because as an example, consider a price floor to be a minimum wage, right. The regulator believes that the market system is delivering a wage which is not very high to the workers, and therefore you want to impose a minimum wage legislation, a minimum wage regulation, and for the minimum wage to be meaningful, it has to be above the equilibrium price or the equilibrium the wage set by the market. So, let us make a note that for a price floor to make sense, to be effective, it must be above the equilibrium price. It must be above the equilibrium price, right. So, let us first draw a picture. Now, the notations that we will use are the following. So, normally we have written Q and P for quantity and the price, but the context in which I want to study a price floor regulation is in the demand for labor and the supply of labor, right. So, I want to look at the quantity of labor demanded and quantity of labor supplied, and instead of the price, I want to think of the wage rate, right. So, this is going to be rupees per labor hour, right, and this is going to be labor hours. So, instead of, so think of demand for labor, this is going to come from the firms are the ones which are demanding labor, and then you are going to have the supply of labor which is going to come from the workers, right. So, that is the context in which I want you to think of the demand curve and the supply curve. So, if you look at the demand for labor, that is going to be given by this downward sloping line. As the wage rate decreases, the quantity demanded of labor increases. As the wage rate increases, the quantity demanded of labor decreases. Similarly, you are going to have a supply of labor. The supply of labor. What is this supply curve telling us? In the previous examples, we have said that the supply curve is the sum of the marginal cost curve, right. So, if you think of it in terms of production of goods, each point on the supply curve is going to tell you what is the marginal cost of production. Here, the supply curve is telling us the wage at which some worker is willing to participate in the market, right. So, think of this as a measure of efficiency of the workers. So, workers who are somewhere here are ones who have lower marginal costs, which means they are willing to participate in the market as long as the wage was this number. And as the wage increases, more and more workers want to participate in the market. The less efficient workers also are interested in participating in the market. Now, in the absence of any regulation, the demand curve and the supply curve are going to intersect at this wage W star, and the equilibrium quantity of labor traded is going to be L star. The quantity demanded of labor is L star, the quantity supplied of labor is L star, and L star is therefore the equilibrium quantity traded. Let us put some notations. So, as before we call this A, B and D, and as before let us now compute the consumer surplus. So, initially in the absence of any price floor, the consumer surplus. So, think of who is the consumer. The consumers are the firms who are demanding workers because for their plants. So, for any particular unit, here, the willingness to pay of the firm is this point. What the firm actually pays is W star. So, the gap between these two red dots is the gain to the firm, in this case gain to the consumer, i.e. the firm, from that particular unit of labor. So, if I aggregate all these gains from the 0th unit till the L starth unit, I will have the area A, B, W star, right. So, the consumer surplus is the area A, B and W star, because you are going to be aggregating these gains. Now, for the producer or the supplier of labor, which are the workers. So, let us just make a note here so that we do not forget. So, the supply side are the workers, these are the firms. For the workers, so let us say this particular labor hour. For this particular labor hour, the wage that this labor hour is going to get is W star. Now, his marginal cost of participating in the market, or the wage at which he would happily participate in the market, is given by this lower blue dot. So, the gap between these two blue dots is going to be the gain to this labor hour when it participates in the market. And if I aggregate all the gains from the 0th labor hour to the L starth labor hour, I will be getting the area W star, B and D. So, the worker surplus or the producer surplus is the area W star, B and D. Now, if you aggregate these two, you are going to get the total area A, B and D as before, right. So, even under a ceiling, if this was our status quo, we had quantity of goods and on the y direction was the price. If you aggregate the producer surplus and the consumer surplus, you would have gotten the area A, B and D. Now, government or the regulator. So, government feels that the wage W star is too low, right. So, the government feels that the wage W star is too low, and on the grounds of fairness or equity, imposes a floor at W bar, right. This is think of this as the minimum wage, right. Now, as we said, for this price floor to be effective, it has to be above the equilibrium price W star, right, because if you impose something below W star, anyway the market system is delivering a wage W star. So, essentially the firms and workers would simply ignore that W bar which is lower than W star, and all trades will take place at W star, which is that firms will hire workers at W star and workers, the L star workers will participate at by receiving the wage W star per hour. Now, let us ask what is the impact of having this regulation. Now, the moment the wage is W bar, more and more workers are now interested in participating in the market. So, the quantity supplied of labor is going to increase. So, this is QS. Now, I will be consistent and I will try and use the notation LS. This is the quantity supplied of labor, right. And because the wage is higher, the quantity demanded of workers is going to be a lot lower. This is LD, right. So, at W bar, the market gets distorted, just as we had the case for the price ceiling also, right. Even in the case of the price ceiling, the moment the ceiling was imposed at P bar, which was lower than the equilibrium price, it distorted or created a mismatch between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. So, similarly at W bar, the market gets distorted as the quantity of labor supplied is greater than the quantity of labor demanded, right. So, again now we need some rule. So, the number of workers, so more number of workers are available than what the firms need. So, we need some rationing rule to allocate these LS workers across the LD firms, right. So, there is an excess supply of labor. Now, in the absence, if you started with this scenario and if there was no price floor regulation, in the absence of any regulation, the market's way of clearing the excess would be to lower the price, right. So, if there is an excess supply, the way that excess supply would be cleared is if the wage were to come down or the price were to come down. So, if the price comes down from W bar to W star, then there will not be any excess supply and the quantity demanded of labor would be exactly equal to the quantity supplied of labor. Now, but we have the regulation which is at W bar, so we need some rule, and again the assumption that we are going to be imposing is the following. Now, let us understand how in the case of the ceiling price, notice the regulation was that the scarce number of units are allocated across the buyers who value them the most. This was the willingness to pay, right. Now, for a floor, what I have is LD number of firms. So, think of this case one firm, one worker, right. So, LD number of firms each want to hire a worker. The quantity of workers available is a lot more. So, what should be my rationing rule? Well, if these LD firms are to get LD number of workers, then or LD labor hours, then we allocate the workers across the firms such that only the most efficient workers are getting allocated, right. So, recall this is the marginal cost, or essentially in the context of this example, it is telling us the price at which a worker is willing to participate in the market, right. So, the assumption that we are going to be imposing is that the most efficient, i.e. the lowest marginal cost, the most efficient workers, labor hours, are allocated across the LD firms. Now, I am sure you are rightfully wondering, well, how does the regulator know what is the marginal cost of each labor hour, right? How does the regulator also know the efficiency of each worker? People may also distort, right? So, somebody who is inefficient may claim that he or she is efficient. Now, these are absolutely valid questions, but in our case we are looking at a full information scenario. So, suppose imagine that by looking at the productivity of workers, the regulator is able to identify their efficiency, right. So, the most efficient workers are allocated across the LD firms, which essentially means that LD labor hours are allocated across the LD firms. Across the LD firms. Now, with this rationing rule, let us ask what can we say about the firm's surplus, the consumer surplus, the worker surplus, and what is the impact of this on the total surplus, right. So, let us start and to sort of be very particular. So, think of this as the firm surplus and think of this as the worker surplus, right. So, F for the firm, W for the worker. Now, let us think of what the firm surplus is with the price floor. Now, previously the firms were paying W star and were employing L star workers. Now, the firms are paying W bar, right. So, the wage has gone up and they are employing LD workers. So, they are paying more and employing less. So, that can't make the firms happy. So, for each of those units, the willingness to pay of the firms was given by this dot. What they actually pay is W bar. So, essentially this is the gain to the firm from this particular labor hour. If I aggregate all of those gains, the firm surplus is going to be this area of this triangle, and let me put some notations. I will call this to be E and I will call this to be F. So, the area AEW bar is going to be the surplus to the firms. Now, let us ask what is the surplus to the workers. W bar is the wage received per hour by each labor hour that participates. So, if I look at this particular labor hour, it is going to now get W bar. The marginal cost or the supply price at which this worker is interested in participating is this number. So, essentially this gap is the gain to this particular labor hour. If you aggregate all of these gains, you are going to get this particular area across 0 to LD workers. So, the worker surplus is this area W bar, E, F and D, right. So, one thing is very clear from this graph, that the firm surplus or the consumer surplus has decreased, right, because the area AEW bar is smaller than the area ABW star. What about the producer surplus or the worker surplus? In this graph, by looking at the picture, we really do not know, because we are comparing the trapezoidal area W bar EFD with the triangular zone W star B and D. So, we really can't say clearly which one is higher. So, what about total surplus? The total surplus is the sum of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus, that is this area A, E, F and D. So, one thing we can say for sure is that the total surplus, which is this area AEFD, is smaller than the total surplus in the absence of the price floor, which was A, B and D. So, clearly we can see that the total surplus, the deadweight loss, which is the total surplus before minus the total surplus now, is the area ABD, right. So, it is the area ABD minus the area AEFD. AEFD, which is this area BEF, right. So, BE and F is the size of the deadweight loss. And again, let us ask, what is the source of the deadweight loss? Well, take any particular unit. The source of the deadweight loss are that now, after the price floor has been imposed, the number of units traded has decreased from L star to LD. So, if I take a particular labor hour here, the firms were willing to pay up to these many rupees to get this particular labor hour. This particular labor hour would have happily participated in the market at this particular wage. Since the willingness to pay is greater than the supply price, if that particular unit had been traded, in the sense if that firm had hired the worker and the worker had participated, we would have obtained a gain equal to this orange line. And because that unit is not traded, this orange line gain is no longer captured. And if I aggregate across all units from LD to L star, I would get this area BEF, which are gains which are no longer being captured, right. So, let us make a note of that. The source of the deadweight loss are the LD to L star workers who are no longer employed, who are no longer participating in the market. For all of these labor hours, for all these labor units, the willingness to pay of firms was greater than the supply price. Think of this as the marginal cost of participating in this market, which means that society would have gained the area BEF if all these labor units were allotted among the firms, right. If all of these units were participating, then society would have gotten the area, but they are not participating because of the presence of the price floor, which means that there is a deadweight loss equal to the area B, E and F, right. So, the source of the deadweight loss is because there are labor hours between LD and L star units which were being traded before. When I say which were being traded before, what I mean is these are labor hours where firms were interested in willing to pay a wage which was much greater than what their supply price was, and therefore, they would have happily participated, but they are not, and therefore, there is a deadweight loss which is being generated. So, the source of deadweight loss is always this distortion for these units which are no longer being traded. For each of these units, the willingness to pay was greater than the supply price, and therefore, those are the gains that are not being captured. Now, let us take a very simple example. I will use the same numbers as I had earlier, but now we will do it in the context of a price floor. So, as before, let us say the demand for workers is, let us say 10 minus 1/2 of W, or rather let me use notations which are consistent. So, let us say I have the demand for workers which is 10 minus 1/2 of W, and the supply of workers is given by W minus 2, right, which is to say that unless the workers receive a wage at least equal to 2, they are not interested in participating. So, as before, let us draw the demand for labor and the supply of labor. If W is 0, the quantity demanded of labor is 10. If W is 20, the quantity demanded of labor is 0. So, the demand for labor curve is essentially this. So, this is LD, demand for labor, and the supply of labor starts from W equal to 2, and this is what the supply curve is. Now, as before, initially, let us just repeat it. The equilibrium is obtained by setting the quantity demanded to equal the quantity supplied. So, if you do the arithmetic, you will find that the equilibrium wage is W star. So, you should check that the equilibrium W star is 8 rupees per labor hour, and the equilibrium quantity traded is equal to 6 labor hours. So, initially the W star is 8 and L star is equal to 6. Since I have already done it for the previous example, I am not repeating it. So, you should check it again. Now, let us also identify what the consumer surplus is. We have also done it earlier. So, this is A, B and D, right. So, the consumer surplus is, or the surplus to the firms is the area A, B, W star. So, that is 1/2 times the base of the triangle, which is 6, times the height. So, 20 minus 8 is 12, times the base of the triangle is 6. So, that is going to be 72 divided by 6, which is equal to rupees 36. So, this is the same as before. The producer's surplus is the area W star B and D. So, 1/2 times 8 minus 2, which is 6, times the gap of 6. So, 36 divided by 2, rupees 18. So, which tells us that the total surplus is rupees 54. there is no change here, right. So, this was the numbers that I had earlier. So, there is absolutely no change in that. Now, suppose a price floor W bar, which is, for it to be effective, it has to be greater than the equilibrium price. So, let us say a price floor which is equal to 12 is imposed. W bar is equal to 12. Now, that is going to distort the market. The quantity supplied of labor is going to be 12 minus 10, 12 minus 2, which is equal to 10. So, this is my LS. Because of the higher wage, firms are going to move along or going to move up along their demand curve, and the quantity demanded of workers is going to be 10 minus 1/2 of 12. So, 10 minus 6, which is equal to 4. So, this is going to be LD. So, now once a price floor is imposed, there is a mismatch between the quantity supplied of labor and the quantity demanded of labor. So, as before, we need some allocation rule, and the assumption that we will impose is the following, that these workers are imposed such that the most efficient workers are the ones who are being allocated among these LD firms. So, which means that only the most efficient workers are allocated between these LD firms. So, let us call this E and this is F, right. So, once the price floor is imposed, I am sorry. So, let us now compute. Let us start with the surplus to the firms. Firms are now hiring less and are paying more, right. So, take a particular labor hour. For this particular labor hour, the willingness to pay is this much, what the firm actually pays is this amount. So, this is the gain to the firm from that particular unit, and if I aggregate all the gains between the 0th unit till the LDth unit, the consumer surplus is going to be 1/2 times the base of the triangle, which is equal to 4, times the height, which is 20 minus 12. So, that is 8 times 4, which is rupees 16. So, now notice that consumer surplus or the surplus to the firms has come down, right. So, CS is decreased by rupees 20, right. So, there is a straight reduction in the consumer surplus. But what about the workers? Well, the workers who are lucky enough to find employment. So, let us take this particular labor hour. This particular labor hour now gets W bar, which is 12, because that is the minimum wage. The supply price is this number, that is the marginal cost. So, the gap between the wage and the supply price is this amount. So, if I aggregate all of these gains from the 0th unit till the LDth unit, I am going to get this particular area, right. So, the producer's surplus is going to be the area W bar. So, that is the area W bar, E, F and D, right. So, that is this trapezoidal area. Now, I am going to use the sum of the areas. So, that is 1/2, the rule is 1/2 times the sum of the parallel sides. So, W bar D plus E F times the height, which is W bar E. So, if I do that, so that is going to give me 1/2 times W bar D is 12 minus 2, which is 10, E F is 12 minus, I need to identify what this point is. Notice the supply curve is W minus 2 and I have a L is equal to 4. So, I have essentially 4 equals W minus 2. So, W is essentially going to be 6 here, right. So, that is going to be 12 minus 6, which is 6 times the height. Well, the height or this gap is essentially 4. So, that is 16 times 4. So, 1/2 times 16 times 4. So, that is rupees 32. So, now notice that compared to the previous case, the producer's surplus has increased by rupees 14. Now, CS decreased by 20, of which 14 got transferred to the producer. which means the one accounted for is still 6, right. So, rupees 6 is not accounted. So, the total surplus now is the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus, which is rupees 48. Previously it was 54. So, the deadweight loss is rupees 54 minus 48 which is rupees 6. And notice I can also compute this as the area of this particular triangle, right, for each of these units here. So, take any particular unit here, right, for any of these particular units, the willingness to pay was greater than the supply price. So, this would have been the gains that could have been captured. If I aggregate the gains of across all the units from LD to L star, I am essentially going to get the area B, E and F, which is 1/2 times the base of the triangle, which is 6 minus 4, which is 2, times the height. Well, the height is going to be 12 minus 6, which is 6. So, 1/2 times 6 times 2, which is rupees 6, right. So, this is a very simple illustration where we have computed what the impact of the price floor on the total surplus is. As an exercise, try repeating this same example. If instead of W bar equal to 12, we imposed W bar equal to rupees 10 per hour, or when we imposed W bar equals rupees 14 per hour, right. So, check this and find out what is the impact of this price floor on the total surplus. Has the total surplus reduced by a bigger amount, which is to say, has the deadweight loss become bigger, or is the deadweight loss smaller than rupees 6. So, we have looked between the last two lectures, we have looked at two regulations, a ceiling and a price floor. What we will do next is we will talk about the impact of import tariffs and how does import tariff impact the total surplus from trade. That is going to be our next topic. Thank you.